Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 578, Das Boot. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well, and I am a fan of the knee scooter. Yes, indeed. We traveled from the Philadelphia airport to Chicago O'Hare with my 17-year-old on a knee scooter with his foot in a cast. Let me say this about airports and wheelchairs. Chicago O'Hare is a great place to go if you need wheelchair assistance to and from the gate. Philadelphia Airport, not so much. I'm just going to be honest with you. Not so great. It was flustercluck in many ways in Philadelphia, where we began and where we ended. We did manage to successfully get on and off the plane, although evidently my child left his Switch at our seat. We have put in a request for somebody to find it, kind of thing, and have yet to hear back. So that's unfortunate. Merry Christmas. Aside from that, though, it was a great trip. It was surreal in that it wasn't surreal. I think that makes sense. Lovely to see human people we're related to, human people who we love, human people who we hadn't gotten a chance to see last year. It was just really, really supremely awesome to have a chance to do that. So I hope you, in all of your, if you are in the United States or an expat, thrown adrift into the world, I hope you all had a wonderful time giving thanks in your own way, and that it wasn't lonely and as miserable as it may have been last year, because this year was definitely a step up. That said, I have been watching as a quality assurance analyst these days. It's part of the training gig at the company that I'm working for now. I have been watching nothing but contact tracing and case investigation phone calls where people's symptom onset was Thursday night. That would be the night of Thanksgiving, or the morning of the Friday after Thanksgiving. And then they got tested Friday, Saturday, or Sunday and wound up in our system this Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I'm expecting the numbers to spike here in the United States a little bit. So I'm going to give you my helpful tip of the day. If you plan to travel, get an antigen kit, one of the little antigen test kits, and test yourself 2 days before you plan to fly. The test kits aren't cheap here in the States, or at least in Pennsylvania. The test kits aren't cheap. So if you can afford to do one the day before, 2 days out, and the day before you travel, that would be great. If you can only do it, do one 2 days before, do one after you have arrived, and then do one 2 days after you've arrived. Depending on how long you're staying, that would make sense or not. Here's why. If you think about what I just said, that people who were exposed to COVID sometime on Thursday, November 25th, if they were exposed during the day and started to have symptom onset that night, that indicates how quickly, in quite a few people, the virus can cook up enough to make you start to feel bad. There are other people who were exposed on Thanksgiving but didn't start to feel sick until several days later, or didn't feel sick at all but had implemented this kind of testing protocol. So why does that matter? It matters this way. Testing at home is safer because you don't have to risk, if you are sick, going out and mingling with people who aren't yet sick. So that's one. 2, the home test kits are really quite good at screening out danger. So if you already have symptoms and you get a test kit and the test kit comes back negative and you're sitting there going, yeah, I know it says negative, but man, I feel like this is COVID. I'm looking at the list of symptoms and I've got all of them. Or even, God forbid, you've lost your sense of taste or smell, which is kind of a dead giveaway. If the symptoms are saying COVID and the home kit test is not, that's when you leave the house and you go to a secure site and get a PCR test. That's a brain swab test. If you are feeling lousy, but you don't have any definitive COVID symptoms, you haven't lost your sense of taste or smell, you're just feeling lousy. The test kit comes back negative. You're feeling lousy. I would stay in bed. Don't go around any people, just like if you had the flu. 2 days later, test yourself again. If at that point it is still saying negative, you really are negative. The antigen tests have a narrower range of accuracy, but that's because they're supposed to. They're supposed to be the quick and dirty tests to quickly get you out of circulation. So if we were all testing ourselves every morning before we left the house, on any day that we were going to leave the house, we would have eliminated this sucker a long time ago. Since we haven't done that, chances are we're never going to eliminate this sucker. But as we're starting to hear rumors of, and Kelly brought this up at the Thursday night Zoom on Craftlet, the Craftlet chat Zoom thing. I'm being so articulate today. Woo! Omicron may be more transmissible, but it doesn't appear to be any more virulent than Delta was. In fact, it might even be less virulent. And this makes sense because if you think like a virus for a moment, what do you want to do? You want to live. You want to live in as many hosts as you can. If you're killing off your hosts, you are not going to live very long as a virus. So, Delta, being more virulent than Beta and Alpha, made a mistake and started narrowing the number of hosts that it could infect. Omicron appears to be a little bit smarter, maybe because it's named after a transformer. I don't know. Or an Autobot, I guess. I don't know. I am told this by younger people. I know not of what I speak. But I do know this. Antigen test kits are really, really good for screening out potentially infectious people and getting you to stay home, at least long enough to find out if you really are infectious, get you out of circulation during that time, and lower the risk of accidental transmission to other people. If you use one of these test kits and you're feeling fine, just fine, but you have been out and about and around people who may or may not have been so careful with the mask or the vaccine or the whatever, and you do one of these home test kits and it comes back positive, but you feel fine, but it comes back positive, that's when I would pull myself out of circulation, at least for 2 more days, and then do another kit. If it's coming back positive again, well then, oops, stay out of circulation. Figure 10 days after the first positive indication, confirmed indication that you had COVID. That would be the first time you get a test kit that comes up positive. Kind of like a pregnancy test. If you don't have that hormone in you, you are not going to trip a pregnancy test and get a positive. Same thing here. It's very rare that you can get a positive antigen test unless you have had a common cold recently, very recently, super recently, that can mimic the structure of the coronavirus enough to trick the test. Doesn't happen very often. It can happen, doesn't happen very often. It is super, super, super possible to spread COVID when you are asymptomatic. Just because you aren't having symptoms doesn't mean you're not a carrier. And that means you can spread that virus to somebody who is immunocompromised, who hasn't been vaccinated, who is at higher risk than you, and who may not have an asymptomatic reaction to the virus. We don't have that data, how easy it is to spread asymptomatically, because we simply have not spent the last 18 months testing enough people. So, home antigen kits, antigen test kits, super useful. Are they as accurate as a PCR? No, but they are way faster. And if what we're looking to do is keep people out of circulation when they are potentially infectious, this is the way to go. So when we get ready to go to Tucson for the holidays, we will be taking antigen test kits at home 2 days before we get on the plane. We'll be taking those tests again the morning after we arrive, and then we'll take test kits again 2 days later. At that point, we will have been surrounded by only people who have been safe and protected and cautious and careful and masked, and we'll be pretty confident that we're okay. It seems that back in the day with Alpha and Beta, It took longer for the virus to cook to a point where it could be measured by a test. It seems now 2 to 5 days is really pretty much it. People seem to be showing symptoms fast these days. I don't know if they're tracking that data anymore or not, but that's what it's looking like from what we're seeing on the calls. All right, that was my big 10-minute COVID update. I'm done. But what I'm not done with is the Leavenworth case. I know. I'm hearing from you. People are liking the book. I like the book. You're going to really like the chapters today. So we left off with Amy Belden's story, and it was good. It was compelling. It was interesting. There was a lot going on. We learned some about Mary, and it was clear that the story wasn't completely over yet. Well, today we have 2 chapters. Unexpected testimony and Mr. Grice resumes control. And yes, he does. Super fun chapters. There's some wonderful back and forthing between Grice and our lawyer. There is some wonderful Sherlock Holmesian type moments from Mr. Grice in today's chapters as well. I do not believe you are going to need anything more from me. And so we're going to listen to chapters 33 and 34 of The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, read for us by Kevin Green. Here we go.
Chapter 33. Unexpected Testimony. Polonius. What do you read, my lord? Hamlet. Words, words, words. Hamlet. Mrs. Belden paused, lost in the sombre shadow which these words were calculated to evoke, and a short silence fell upon the room. It was broken by my asking for some account of the occurrence she had just mentioned, it being considered a mystery how Hannah could have found entrance into her house without the knowledge of the neighbours.
"Well," said she, "it was a chilly night, and I'd gone to bed early. I was sleeping then in the room off this, when at about 1:45 (the last train goes through R at 12:50) there came a low knock on the window pane at the head of my bed. Thinking that some of the neighbours were sick, I hurriedly rose on my elbow and asked who was there. The answer came in low, muffled tones: 'Hannah, Miss Leavenworth's girl. Please let me in at the kitchen door.' Startled at hearing the well-known voice, and fearing I knew not what, I caught up a lamp and hurried round to the door. 'Is any one with you?' I asked. 'No,' she replied. 'Then come in.' But no sooner had she done so than my strength failed me, and I had to sit down, for I saw she looked very pale and strange, was without baggage, and altogether had the appearance of some wandering spirit. 'Hannah,' I gasped, 'what is it? What has happened? What brings you here in this condition, and at this time of night?' 'Miss Leavenworth has sent me,' she replied, in the low, monotonous tone of one repeating a lesson by rote. 'She told me to come here, said you would keep me. I am not to go out of the house, and no one is to know I am here.' 'But why?' I asked, trembling with 1,000 undefined fears. 'What has occurred?' 'I dare not say,' she whispered. 'I am forbid. I am just to stay here and keep quiet.' 'But,' I began, helping to take off her shawl, the dingy blanket advertised for in the papers, 'you must tell me. She surely did not forbid you to tell me?' 'Yes, she did, every one,' the girl replied, growing white in her persistence. 'And I never break my word. Fire couldn't draw it out of me.' She looked so determined, so utterly unlike herself, as I remembered her in the meek, unobtrusive days of our old acquaintance, that I could do nothing but stare at her. 'You will keep me?' she said. 'You will not turn me away?' 'No,' I said, 'I will not turn you away.' 'And tell no one?' she went on. 'And tell no one,' I repeated. This seemed to relieve her. Thanking me, she quietly followed me upstairs. I put her into the room in which you found her, because it was the most secret one in the house, and there she has remained ever since, satisfied and contented as far as I could see, till this very same horrible day."
"And is that all?" I asked. Did you have no explanation with her afterwards? Did she never give you any information in regard to the transaction which led to her flight?"
"No, sir. She kept a most persistent silence. Neither then nor when upon the next day I confronted her with the papers in my hand, and the awful question upon my lips as to whether her flight had been occasioned by the murder which had taken place in Mr. Leavenworth's household, did she do more than acknowledge she had run away on this account. Some one or something had sealed her lips, and, as she said, fire and torture should never make her speak."
Another short pause followed this. Then, with my mind still hovering about the one point of intensest interest to me, I said: "This story, then, this account which you have just given me of Mary Leavenworth's secret marriage, and the great strait it put her into, a strait from which nothing but her uncle's death could relieve her, together with this acknowledgment of Hannah's that she had left home and taken refuge here, on the insistence of Mary Leavenworth, is the groundwork you have for the suspicions you have mentioned?"
"Yes, sir. That and the proof of her interest in the matter which is given by the letter I received from her yesterday, and which you say you now have in your possession."
"Oh, that letter."
"I know," Mrs. Belden went on in a broken voice, "that it is wrong, in a serious case like this, to draw hasty conclusions. But, oh, sir, how can I help it, knowing what I do?"
I did not answer. I was revolving in my mind the old question: was it possible, in face of all these later developments, still to believe Mary Leavenworth's own hand guiltless of her uncle's blood?
"It is dreadful to come to such conclusions," proceeded Mrs. Belden, "and nothing but her own words written in her own hand would ever have driven me to them, but—"
"Pardon me," I interrupted, "but you said in the beginning of this interview that you did not believe Mary herself had any direct hand in her uncle's murder. Are you ready to repeat that assertion?"
"Yes, yes, indeed. Whatever I may think of her influence in inducing it, I never could imagine her as having anything to do with its actual performance. Oh no, oh no! Whatever was done on that dreadful night, Mary Leavenworth never put a hand to pistol or ball, or even stood by while they were used. That you may be sure of. Only the man who loved her, longed for her, and felt the impossibility of obtaining her by any other means could have found nerve for an act so horrible."
"Then you think—"
"Mr. Clavering is the man? I do. And, oh, sir, when you consider that he is her husband, is it not dreadful enough?"
"It is, indeed," said I, rising to conceal how much I was affected by this conclusion of hers. Something in my tone or appearance seemed to startle her.
"I hope and trust I have not been indiscreet," she cried, eyeing me with something like an incipient distrust. "With this dead girl lying in my house, I ought to be very careful, I know, but—"
"You have said nothing," was my earnest assurance, as I edged towards the door in my anxiety to escape, if but for a moment, from an atmosphere that was stifling me. "No one can blame you for anything you have either said or done to day. But," and here I paused and walked hurriedly back, "I wish to ask one question more. Have you any reason, beyond that of natural repugnance, to believing a young and beautiful woman guilty of a great crime for saying what you have of Henry Clavering, a gentleman who has hitherto been mentioned by you with respect?"
"No,"
she whispered, with a touch of her old agitation. I felt the reason insufficient, and turned away with something of the same sense of suffocation with which I had heard that the missing key had been found in Eleanore Leavenworth's possession. "You must excuse me," I said. "I want to be a moment by myself, in order to ponder over the facts which I have just heard. I will soon return," and without further ceremony hurried from the room. By some indefinable impulse I went immediately upstairs, and took my stand at the western window of the large room directly over Mrs. Belden. The blinds were closed. The room was shrouded in funereal gloom, but its sombreness and horror were for the moment unfelt. I was engaged in a fearful debate with myself. Was Mary Leavenworth the principal, or merely the accessory in this crime? Did the determined prejudice of Mr. Gryce, The convictions of Eleanor, the circumstantial evidence even of such facts as had come to our knowledge, preclude the possibility that Mrs. Belden's conclusions were correct. That all the detectives interested in the affair would regard the question as settled, I did not doubt. But need it be? Was it utterly impossible to find evidence yet that Henry Clavering was, after all, the assassin of Mr. Leavenworth? Filled with the thought, I looked across the room to the closet, where lay the body of the girl who, according to all probability, had known the truth of the matter, and a great longing seized me. Oh, why could not the dead be made to speak? Why should she lie there so silent, so pulseless, so inert, when a word from her were enough to decide the awful question? Was there no power to compel those pallid lips to move? Carried away by the fervor of the moment, I made my way to her side. Ah, God, how still! With what a mockery the closed lips and lids confronted my demanding gaze. A stone could not have been more unresponsive. With a feeling that was almost like anger, I stood there, when what was it I saw protruding from beneath her shoulders, where they crushed against the bed? An envelope? A letter? Yes. Dizzy with the sudden surprise, overcome with the wild hopes this discovery awakened, I stooped in great agitation and drew the letter out. It was sealed, but not directed. Breaking it hastily open, I took a glance at its contents. Good heavens! It was the work of the girl herself. Its very appearance was enough to make that evident. Feeling as if a miracle had happened, I hastened with it into the other room and set myself to decipher the awkward scrawl. This is what I saw, rudely printed in lead pencil on the inside of a sheet of common writing paper. I am a wicked girl. I have known things all the time which I had ought to have told, but I didn't dare to. He said he would kill me if I did. I mean the tall, splendid-looking gentleman with the black moustache, who I met coming out of Mr. Leavenworth's room with a key in his hand the night Mr. Leavenworth was murdered. He was so scared he gave me money and made me go away and come here and keep everything secret, but I can't do so no longer. I seem to see Miss Eleanor all the time crying and asking me if I want her sent to prison. God knows I'd rather die. And this is the truth and my last words, and I pray everybody's forgiveness, and hope nobody will blame me, and that they won't bother Miss Eleanor any more, but go and look after the handsome gentleman with the black moustache. End of chapter 33. Book 4. The Problem Solved. Chapter 34. Mr. Grice resumes control. It out-Herods Herod. Hamlet. A thing devised by the enemy. Richard III. A half hour had passed. The train upon which I had every reason to expect Mr. Grice had arrived, and I stood in the doorway awaiting with indescribable agitation the slow and laboured approach of the motley group of men and women whom I had observed leave the depot at the departure of the cars. Would he be among them? Was the telegram of a nature peremptory enough to make his presence here, sick as he was, an absolute certainty? The written confession of Hannah throbbing against my heart, a heart all elation now, as but a short half hour before it had been all doubt and struggle, seemed to rustle distrust, and the prospect of a long afternoon spent in impatience was rising before me, when a portion of the advancing crowd turned off into a side street, and I saw the form of Mr. Grice hobbling, not on two sticks, but very painfully on one, coming slowly down the street. His face, as he approached, was a study. "Well, well, well," he exclaimed as we met at the gate. "This is a pretty how d'ye do, I must say. Hannah dead, eh? And everything turned topsy-turvy. And what do you think of Mary Leavenworth now?" It would therefore seem natural, in the conversation which followed his introduction into the house and instalment in Mrs. Belden's parlour, that I should begin my narration by showing him Hannah's confession, but it was not so. Whether it was that I felt anxious to have him go through the same alternations of hope and fear it had been my lot to experience since I came to R, or whether, in the depravity of human nature, there lingered within me sufficient resentment for the persistent disregard he had always paid to my suspicions of Henry Clavering, to make it a matter of moment to me to spring this knowledge upon him just at the instant his own convictions seemed to have reached the point of absolute certainty, I cannot say. Enough that it was not till I had given him a full account of every other matter connected with my stay in this house, not till I saw his eye beaming and his lip quivering with the excitement incident upon the perusal of the letter from Mary, found in Mrs. Belden's pocket, not indeed until I became assured from such expressions as "tremendous," "the deepest game of the season," "nothing like it since the Lafarge affair," that in another moment he would be uttering some theory or belief that once heard would for ever stand like a barrier between us, did I allow myself to hand him the letter I had taken from under the dead body of Hannah. I shall never forget his expression as he received it. "Good heavens!" cried he. "What's this?" "A dying confession of the girl Hannah. I found it lying in her bed when I went up a half hour ago to take a second look at her." Opening it, he glanced over it with an incredulous air, that speedily, however, turned to one of the utmost astonishment, as he hastily perused it, and then stood turning it over and over in his hand, examining it. "A remarkable piece of evidence," I observed, not without a certain feeling of triumph. "Quite changes the aspect of affairs." "Think so?" he sharply retorted. Then, whilst I stood staring at him in amazement, his manner was so different from what I expected, looked up and said, "You tell me that you found this in her bed. Whereabouts in her bed?" "Under the body of the girl herself," I returned. "I saw one corner of it protruding from beneath her shoulders, and drew it out." He came and stood before me. "Was it folded or open when you first looked at it?" "Folded, fastened up in this envelope," showing it to him. He took it, looked at it for a moment, and went on with his questions. "This envelope has a very crumpled appearance, as well as the letter itself. Were they so when you found them?" "Yes, not only so, but doubled up, as you see." "Doubled up? You are sure of that? Folded, sealed, and then doubled up, as if her body had rolled across it while alive?" "Yes." "No trickery about it? No look as if the thing had been insinuated there since her death?" "Not at all. I should rather say that to every appearance she held it in her hand when she lay down, but turning over, dropped it, and then laid upon it." Mr. Gryce's eyes, which had been very bright, ominously clouded. Evidently he had been disappointed in my answers. Paying the letter down, he stood musing, but suddenly lifted it again, scrutinized the edges of the paper on which it was written, and, darting me a quick look, vanished with it into the shade of the window curtain. His manner was so peculiar, I involuntarily rose to follow, but he waved me back, saying, "Amuse yourself with that box on the table, which you had such an ado over. See if it contains all we have a right to expect to find in it. I want to be by myself for a moment." Subduing my astonishment, I proceeded to comply with his request. But scarcely had I lifted the lid of the box before me when he came hurrying back, flung the letter down on the table with an air of the greatest excitement, and cried, "Did I say there had never been anything like it since the Lafarge affair? I tell you there has never been anything like it in any affair. This is the rummiest case on record. Mr. Raymond," and his eyes, in his excitement, actually met mine for the first time in my experience of him, "prepare yourself for a disappointment. This pretended confession of Hannah's is a fraud." "A fraud?" "Yes, fraud, forgery, what you will. The girl never wrote it." Amazed, outraged almost, I bounded from my chair. "How do you know that?" I cried. Bending forward, he put the letter into my hand. "Look at it," said he. "Examine it closely. Now tell me what is the first thing you notice in regard to it." "Why, the first thing that strikes me is that the words are printed instead of written, something which might be expected from this girl according to all accounts." "Well?" "That they are printed on the inside of a sheet of ordinary paper." "Ordinary paper?" "Yes." "That is a sheet of commercial note of the ordinary quality." "Of course." "But is it?" "Why, yes, I should say so." "Look at the lines." "What of them?" "Oh, I see, they run up close to the top of the page. Evidently the scissors have been used here. In short, it is a large sheet, trimmed down to the size of commercial note." "Yes." "And is that all you see?" "All but the words." "Don't you perceive what has been lost by means of this trimming down?" "No, unless you mean the manufacturer's stamp in the corner." Mr. Gryce's glance took meaning. "But I don't see why the loss of that should be deemed a matter of any importance." "Don't you? Not when you consider that by it we seem to be deprived of all opportunity of tracing this sheet back to the quire of paper from which it was taken?" "No." "Humph! Then you are more of an amateur than I thought you. Don't you see that as Hannah could have had no motive for concealing where the paper came from on which she wrote her dying words, this sheet must have been prepared by some one else?" "No," said I, "I cannot say that I see all that." "Can't? Well, then, answer me this. Why should Hannah, a girl about to commit suicide, care whether any clue was furnished in her confession to the actual desk, drawer, or quire of paper from which the sheet was taken on which she wrote it?" "She wouldn't." "Yet especial pains have been taken to destroy that clue." "But—" "Then there is another thing. Read the confession itself, Mr. Raymond, and tell me what you gather from it." "Why," I said, after complying, "that the girl, worn out with constant apprehension, has made up her mind to do away with herself, and that Henry Clavering—" "Henry Clavering?" The interrogation was put with so much meaning. I looked up. "Yes," said I. "Ah, I didn't know that Mr. Clavering's name was mentioned there. Excuse me?" "His name is not mentioned, but a description is given so strikingly in accordance—" Here Mr. Gryce interrupted me. "Does it not seem a little surprising to you that a girl like Hannah should have stopped to describe a man she knew by name?" I started. It was unnatural, surely. "You believe Mrs. Belden's story, don't you?" "Yes." "Consider her accurate in her relation of what took place here a year ago?" "I do." "Must believe, then, that Hannah, the go between, was acquainted with Mr. Clavering and with his name?" "Undoubtedly." "Then why didn't she use it? If her intention was, as she here professes, to save Eleanore Leavenworth from the false imputation which had fallen upon her, she would naturally take the most direct method of doing it. This description of a man whose identity she could have at once put beyond a doubt by the mention of his name, is the work, not of a poor ignorant girl, but of some person who, in attempting to play the rôle of one, has signally failed. But that is not all. Mrs. Belden, according to you, maintains that Hannah told her upon entering the house that Mary Leavenworth sent her here. But in this document she declares it to have been the work of Black Moustache. I know, but could they not have both been parties to the transaction? Yes, said he, yet it is always a suspicious circumstance when there is a discrepancy between the written and spoken declaration of a person. But why do we stand here fooling when a few words from this Mrs. Belden you talk so much about will probably settle the whole matter? A few words from Mrs. Belden, I repeated. I have had thousands from her to-day, and find the matter no nearer settled than in the beginning. You have had, said he, but I have not. Fetch her in, Mr. Raymond. I rose. One thing, said I, before I go. What if Hannah had found the sheet of paper trimmed just as it is, and used it without any thought of the suspicions it would occasion? Ah, said he, that is just what we are going to find out. Mrs. Belden was in a flutter of impatience when I entered the sitting-room. When did I think the coroner would come, and what did I imagine this detective would do for us? It was dreadful waiting there alone for something, she knew not what. I calmed her as well as I could, telling her the detective had not yet informed me what he could do, having some questions to ask her first. Would she come in to see him? She rose with alacrity. Anything was better than suspense. Mr. Grice, who, in the short interim of my absence, had altered his mood from the severe to the beneficent, received Mrs. Belden with just that show of respectful courtesy likely to impress a woman as dependent as she upon the good opinion of others. Ah, and this is the lady in whose house this very disagreeable event has occurred, he exclaimed, partly rising in his enthusiasm to greet her. May I request you to sit? He asked. If a stranger may be allowed to take the liberty of inviting a lady to sit in her own house. It does not seem like my own house any longer, said she, but in a sad rather than aggressive tone, so much had his genial way imposed upon her. A little better than a prisoner here, go and come, keep silence or speak, just as I am bidden, and all because an unhappy creature, whom I took in for the most unselfish of motives, has chanced to die in my house. Just so, exclaimed Mr. Grice. It is very unjust, but perhaps we can right matters. I have every reason to believe we can. This sudden death ought to be easily explained. You say you had no poison in the house? No, sir. And that the girl never went out? Never, sir. And that no one has ever been here to see her? No one, sir. So that she could not have procured any such thing if she had wished? No, sir. Unless, he added suavely, she had it with her when she came here. That couldn't have been, sir. She brought no baggage, and as for her pocket, I know everything there was in it, for I looked. And what did you find there? Some money in bills, more than you would have expected such a girl to have, some loose pennies, and a common handkerchief. Well, then, it is proved the girl didn't die of poison, there being none in the house. He said this in so convinced a tone she was deceived. That is just what I've been telling Mr. Raymond, giving me a triumphant look. Must have been heart disease, he went on. You say she was well yesterday? Yes, sir, or seemed so. Though not cheerful. I did not say that. She was, sir, very. What, ma'am? This girl? Giving me a look. I don't understand that. I should think her anxiety about those she had left behind her in the city would have been enough to keep her from being very cheerful. So you would, returned Mrs. Belden, but it wasn't so. On the contrary, she never seemed to worry about them at all. What? Not about Miss Eleanor?
who, according to the papers, stands in so cruel a position before the world. But perhaps she didn't know anything about that. Miss Leavenworth's position, I mean." "Yes, she did, for I told her. I was so astonished I could not keep it to myself. You see, I had always considered Eleanor as one above a reproach, and it so shocked me to see her name mentioned in the newspaper in such a connection that I went to Hannah and read the article aloud, and watched her face to see how she took it."
"And how did she?"
"I can't say. She looked as if she didn't understand, asked me why I read such things to her, and told me she didn't want to hear any more, that I'd promised not to trouble her about this murder, and that if I continued to do so she wouldn't listen."
And what else?"
"Nothing else. She put her hand over her ears and frowned in such a sullen way I left the room."
"That was when?"
"About 3 weeks ago."
"She has, however, mentioned the subject since?"
"No, sir, not once."
"What? Not asked what they were going to do with her mistress?"
"No, sir."
"She has shown, however, that something was preying on her mind. Fear, remorse, or anxiety?"
"No, sir. On the contrary, she has oftener appeared like one secretly elated."
"But," exclaimed Mr. Gryce, with another sidelong look at me, "that was very strange and unnatural. I cannot account for it."
"Nor I, sir. I used to try to explain it by thinking her sensibilities had been blunted, or that she was too ignorant to comprehend the seriousness of what had happened. But as I learned to know her better, I gradually changed my mind. There was too much method in her gaiety for that. I could not help seeing she had some future before her for which she was preparing herself. As for instance, she asked me one day if I thought she could learn to play on the piano, and I finally came to the conclusion she had been promised money if she kept the secret entrusted to her, and was so pleased with the prospect that she forgot the dreadful past and all connected with it. At all events, that was the only explanation I could find for her general industry and desire to improve herself, or the complacent smiles I detected now and then stealing over her face when she didn't know I was looking."
Not such a smile as crept over the countenance of Mr. Gryce at that moment, I warrant.
"It was all this," continued Mrs. Belden, "which made her death such a shock to me. I couldn't believe that so cheerful and healthy a creature could die like that, all in one night, without anybody knowing anything about it. But—"
"Wait one moment," Mr. Gryce here broke in. "You speak of her endeavors to improve herself. What do you mean by that?"
"Her desire to learn things she didn't know, as, for instance, to write and read writing. She could only clumsily print when she came here."
I thought Mr. Gryce would take a piece out of my arm, he gripped it so. "When she came here, do you mean to say that since she has been with you she has learned to write?"
"Yes, sir. I used to set her copies, and—"
"Where are these copies?" broke in Mr. Gryce, subduing his voice to its most professional tone. "And where are her attempts at writing? I'd like to see some of them. Can't you get them for us?"
"I don't know, sir. I always made a point to destroy them as soon as they had answered their purpose. I didn't like to have such things lying around. But I will go and see."
"Do," said he, "and I will go with you. I want to take a look at things upstairs anyway." And heedless of his rheumatic feet, he rose and prepared to accompany her. "This is getting very intense," I whispered as he passed me. The smile he gave me in reply would have made the fortune of a Thespian Mephistopheles. Of the 10 minutes of suspense which I endured in their absence I say nothing. At the end of that time they returned with their hands full of paper boxes, which they flung down on the table. "The writing paper of the household," observed Mr. Gryce. "Every scrap and half sheet which could be found. But before you examine it, look at this." And he held out a sheet of bluish foolscap, on which were written some dozen imitations of that time-worn copy, "Be good and you will be happy," with an occasional beauty soon fades, and evil communications corrupt good manners. What do you think of that? Very neat and legible. That is Hannah's latest. The only specimens of her writing to be found. Not much like some scrawls we have seen, eh? No. Mrs. Belden says this girl has known how to write as good as this for more than a week. Took great pride in it, and was continually talking about how smart she was. Leaning over, he whispered in my ear, "This thing you have in your hand must have been scrawled some time ago, if she did it." Then aloud, "But let us look at the paper she used to write on." Dashing open the covers of the boxes on the table, he took out the loose sheets lying inside and scattered them out before me. One glance showed they were all of an utterly different quality from that used in the confession. "This is all the paper in the house," said he. "Are you sure of that?" I asked, looking at Mrs. Belden, who stood in a sort of maze before us. "Wasn't there one stray sheet lying around somewhere, a foolscap or something like that, which she might have got hold of and used without your knowing it?"
"No, sir, I don't think so. I only had these kinds. Besides, Hannah had a whole pile of paper like this in her room, and wouldn't have been apt to go hunting round after any stray sheets."
"But you don't know what a girl like that might do. Look at this one," said I, showing her the blank side of the confession. "Couldn't a sheet like this have come from somewhere about the house? Examine it well, the matter is important."
"I have, and I say no, I never had a sheet of paper like that in my house."
Mr. Gryce advanced and took the confession from my hand. As he did so, he whispered, "What do you think now? Many chances that Hannah got up this precious document?" I shook my head, convinced at last, but in another moment turned to him and whispered back, "But if Hannah didn't write it, who did? And how came it to be found where it was?" "That," said he, "is just what is left for us to learn." And beginning again, he put question after question concerning the girl's life in the house, receiving answers which only tended to show that she could not have brought the confession with her, much less received it from a secret messenger. Unless we doubted Mrs. Belden's word, the mystery seemed impenetrable, and I was beginning to despair of success, when Mr. Gryce, with an askance look at me, leaned towards Mrs. Belden and said, "You received a letter from Miss Mary Leavenworth yesterday, I hear?"
"Yes, sir."
"This letter?" he continued, showing it to her.
"Yes, sir."
"Now, I want to ask you a question. Was the letter as you see it the only contents of the envelope in which it came? Wasn't there one for Hannah enclosed with it?"
"No, sir, there was nothing in my letter for her, but she had a letter herself yesterday. It came in the same mail with mine."
"Hannah had a letter?" we both exclaimed. "And in the mail?"
"Yes, but it was not directed to her. It was," casting me a look full of despair, "directed to me. It was only by a certain mark in the corner of the envelope that I knew—"
"Good heavens!" I interrupted. "Where is this letter? Why didn't you speak of it before? What do you mean by allowing us to flounder about here in the dark, when a glimpse at this letter might have set us right at once?"
"I didn't think anything about it till this minute. I didn't know it was of importance.
But I couldn't restrain myself. "Mrs. Belden, where is this letter?" I demanded. "Have you got it?"
"No," said she. "I gave it to the girl yesterday. I haven't seen it since."
"It must be upstairs, then. Let us take another look." And I hastened towards the door. "You won't find it," said Mr. Gryce at my elbow. "I have looked. There is nothing but a pile of burned paper in the corner. By the way, what could that have been?" he asked of Mrs. Belden.
"I don't know, sir. She hadn't anything to burn unless it was the letter."
"We will see about that," I muttered, hurrying upstairs and bringing down the washbowl with its contents. "If the letter was the one I saw in your hand at the post office, it was in a yellow envelope."
"Yes, sir."
Yellow envelopes burn differently from white paper. I ought to be able to tell the tinder made by a yellow envelope when I see it. Ah, The letter has been destroyed. Here is a piece of the envelope." And I drew out of the heap of charred scraps a small bit less burnt than the rest, and held it up. "Then there is no use looking here for what the letter contained," said Mr. Gryce, putting the washbowl aside. "We will have to ask you, Mrs. Belden."
"But I don't know. It was directed to me, to be sure, but Hannah told me, when she first requested me to teach her how to write, that she expected such a letter, so I didn't open it when it came, but gave it to her just as it was."
"You, however, stayed by to see her read it?"
"No, sir. I was in too much of a flurry. Mr. Raymond had just come, and I had no time to think of her. My own letter, too, was troubling me."
"But you surely asked her some questions about it before the day was out?"
"Yes, sir, when I went up with her tea things. But she had nothing to say. Hannah could be as reticent as any one I ever knew when she pleased. She didn't even admit it was from her mistress."
"Ah, then you thought it was from Miss Leavenworth?"
"Why, yes, sir. What else was I to think, seeing that mark in the corner? Though, to be sure, it might have been put there by Mr. Clavering," she thoughtfully added.
"You say she was cheerful yesterday. Was she so after receiving this letter?"
"Yes, sir, as far as I could see. I wasn't with her for long. The necessity I felt of doing something with the box in my charge. But perhaps Mr. Raymond has told you."
Mr. Gryce nodded.
"It was an exhausting evening, and quite put Hannah out of my head, but—"
"Wait!" cried Mr. Gryce, and beckoning me into a corner, he whispered, "Now comes in that experience of Q's. While you are gone from the house, and before Mrs. Belden sees Hannah again, he has a glimpse of the girl bending over something in the corner of her room, which may very fairly be the wash-bowl we found there, after which he sees her swallow, in the most lively way, a dose of something from a bit of paper. Was there anything more?"
"No," said I.
"Very well, then," he cried, going back to Mrs. Belden. "But—"
"But when I went upstairs to bed, I thought of the girl, and going to her door opened it. The light was extinguished, and she seemed asleep, so I closed it again and came out."
"Without speaking?"
"Yes, sir."
"Did you notice how she was lying?"
"Not particularly. I think on her back."
"In something of the same position in which she was found this morning?"
"Yes, sir."
"And that is all you can tell us, either of her letter or her mysterious death?"
"All, sir."
Mr. Gryce straightened himself up. "Mrs. Belden," said he, "you know Mr. Clavering's handwriting when you see it?"
"I do."
"And Miss Leavenworth's?"
"Yes, sir."
"Now, which of the two was upon the envelope of the letter you gave Hannah?"
"I couldn't say. It was a disguised handwriting, and might have been that of either, but I think—"
"Well?"
"That it was more like hers than his, though it wasn't like hers either."
With a smile, Mr. Gryce enclosed the confession in his hand in the envelope in which it had been found. "You remember how large the letter was which you gave her?"
"Oh, it was large, very large, one of the largest sort."
"And thick?"
"Oh, yes, thick enough for 2 letters."
"Large enough and thick enough to contain this?" laying the confession, folded and enveloped as it was, before her.
"Yes, sir."
Giving it a look of startled amazement.
"Large enough and thick enough to contain that."
Mr. Gryce's eyes, bright as diamonds, flashed around the room, and finally settled upon a fly traversing my coat sleeve. "Do you need to ask now," he whispered in a low voice, "where and from whom this so-called confession comes?" He allowed himself one moment of silent triumph, then rising, began folding the papers on the table and putting them in his pocket. "What are you going to do?" I asked, hurriedly approaching. He took me by the arm and led me across the hall into the sitting room. "I am going back to New York. I am going to pursue this matter. I am going to find out from whom came the poison which killed this girl, and by whose hand this vile forgery of a confession was written." "But," said I, rather thrown off my balance by all this, "Q and the coroner will be here presently. Won't you wait to see them?" "No. Clues such as are given here must be followed while the trail is hot. I can't afford to wait." "If I am not mistaken, they have already come," I remarked, as a tramping of feet without announced that some one stood at the door. "That is so," he assented, hastening to let them in. Judging from common experience, we had every reason to fear that an immediate stop would be put to all proceedings on our part as soon as the coroner was introduced upon the scene; but happily for us and the interests at stake, Dr. Fink of R proved to be a very sensible man. He had only to hear a true story of the affair to recognize at once its importance and the necessity of the most cautious action in the matter. Further, by a sort of sympathy with Mr. Gryce, all the more remarkable that he had never seen him before, he expressed himself as willing to enter into our plans, offering not only to allow us the temporary use of such papers as we desired, but even undertaking to conduct the necessary formalities of calling a jury and instituting an inquest in such a way as to give us time for the investigations we proposed to make. The delay was therefore short. Mr. Gryce was enabled to take the 6:30 train for New York, and I to follow on the 10 p.m. The calling of a jury, ordering of an autopsy, and final adjournment of the inquiry till the following Tuesday, having all taken place in the interim.
So, we are getting closer and closer to an end point. In fact, we only have 2 more episodes left for this book, so it will finish before Christmas. And then I will figure out what our next book is going to be. The one thing we know it won't be is Nancy Drew, because it is not in the public domain yet. But wow, okay, we got a lot of information now. Hannah, quite clearly not a suicide. Hannah quite clearly killed by poison that arrived from someone else. Handwriting is disguised. We don't know who it came from. I'm with Grice. I don't know about you. I'm sure you're with me, though. That it is highly unlikely that Hannah, who knew his name, would only describe Clavering. That would be kind of weird. So, now we're kind of at a place where it's anybody's guess. There are quite a few different people who could be the guilty party in this particular crime. And now 2 crimes, because we have the Mr. Leavenworth, and now we have the Miss Hannah. Circles inside of circles. But it's fun, right? I mean, getting a hold of a mystery from this time period that hardly any of us knew anything about, that's kind of fun. I'm excited. I hope you are too. And I know I started off by saying this episode is called Das Boot, and then I talked about Aiden going through the airport in a wheelchair and having a knee scooter and how that was awesome. What I didn't mention was that this morning we went for the post-surgery follow-up. This is after glass was removed finally and completely from the child's foot, and a chunk of bone was removed from the child's foot from when he landed on a mason jar. It's really bad to break a mason jar with your foot. I'm just saying. He does have a boot. Child has a boot. That's awesome. But can only really sort of walk in it and is going to be out of school for another 2 weeks. So we have Das Boot, but it is only sort of what we had hoped the boot would be. So that's kind of stinky. But, you know, it's better than no boot is where we're going to decide we will be philosophically on this issue. So there you are. All right, enough. Have a great week. I will talk to you next week. You take care. Be well. Be safe. Wear a mask. Get a vaccine. Help those around you in any way you can. And I will talk to you next week. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.